Good afternoon, everyone. Our next speaker is the 2024 president of the AIA Middle East and the lead principal with 𝗗𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂's mega projects, the Riyadh's mega projects, the Muqab Central Tower, and 360-degree dome immersive experience. Prior to joining 𝗗𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂𝗂 he was a senior architect and project lead with Adrian Smith and Gordon Hill Architecture in Chicago, where he led the design of numerous international projects ranging from super tall towers to cultural landmarks, including the centerpiece of Expo 2020 Dubai at Al Wasl Plaza and Dome. He is also engaged with the local design and academic community in the UAE through guest lecturers and studio mentoring. Global Filipino architects, let us all welcome architect Timothy Winston Lee.
Okay. Well, first of all, I wanted to say thank you to everybody here. I think it's a great opportunity to talk to you guys about something so fitting, and especially hosting it here in what's Expo City now. And what I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about Al Wasl Dome. This was designed by Adrian Smith and Gordon Gill Architecture, and a little bit about my role while I was with them. I was the project lead for this. And this was a design process that we started almost 8 years to the day now in December 2016, and then worked through the design process and eventually myself relocating here to Dubai to oversee the construction and the handover in 2020 to our client. And what I also wanted to do today was talk a little bit about the design and the high level, but being an architect, and I'm sure a lot of you can relate, wanted to know a little bit about the details and how things go together. If you're anything like me, when you go to a site, you find yourself taking pictures of the details and the bolts, touching the materials and seeing what it's all about. So I thought I'd give you guys a little bit of a behind the scenes into how we actually achieved Al Wasl Dome and some of the processes that went into that. So the first part of the whole process started with us really going back and analyzing what were really the cultural icons of expositions. And with the theme of connecting minds and creating the futures, we knew that we had to create something memorable, also especially because this was the first time that the exposition was being held in the Middle East. So something very formidable and something that the UAE was very proud to host. And if we look back to the very beginning, for example, in 1851 in London, the Crystal Palace, you had the exposition in Paris with the Eiffel Tower, the world's first Ferris wheel in Chicago. All of these were meant to really showcase the country's ability to innovate technology, innovation, and so forth. So this was really one of the principles that guided us when we started to really dig into the details of what we really needed to do for this space. Of course, you guys are probably all familiar with this, but I think the important thing to highlight here is that Al Wasl was actually the confluence of 7 different roads that shape the petals that Gary alluded to earlier. And this was a particularly important point because Al Wasl, meaning loosely translated, meaning connection. We knew that we had to create something that connected people, that really created and curated an experience that people haven't experienced before. So here, just to give a highlight, you can see all the major pathways around the thematic districts and ultimately anchoring at Al Wasl. And one of the things that when we were going through the design process, there's a lot of buildings, all the country pavilions, there's going to be almost a sensory overload. So we knew that it wouldn't need to be a building, but it needed to be a place, more like a forum or an agora, a public plaza where people can go congregate, where people can rest and experience something different. And ultimately, what we ended up with was creating an outdoor room. And I think this is the important part of it. Rather than building a traditional building, we took the approach curating a space where people can go at all times of the year. And one of the key kind of caveats that we had to work towards was obviously the environment here in Dubai. So in the summer, we know it gets almost unbearable with the heat and the humidity. But one thing that you can do, and this is a technique that's been used since the beginning of time here in the Middle East, is shade. So with that, we knew we'll create this central node and this anchor space, but we needed to provide shade. So this is where the idea came to create a dome, not a fully enclosed dome, but something that is translucent, something that allows light to penetrate, a filigree and dancing of the light and shadow on the ground, but also a plaza and a park space so that this helps temper the environment. And at the end of the day, it's really about creating this nodal place for people to gather, but also a park space, which is also so rare in Dubai, and I think something that's highly valued by everybody, myself included. And here, this is back from the expo days, but to really illustrate from the concept render to the actual reality of it. And I think this is also testament to our client's ambition to really pull through with something that is atypical and something that really hadn't been done before. And to this day, I find, especially in the wintertime, highly populated. It's a space where people can really bring their families, enjoy the immersive experience, enjoy food and drink. And then this image, we knew at the very beginning with this expo, it would go on with Expo Legacy and Expo City. So the idea was during the expo itself, you would have more hardscaping and paving because you'd have so many people, there'd be all the events, but eventually transitioning and adding more plant space to really turn it into a garden underneath the trellis. And again, here you can get your orientation. You'll see the UAE pavilion here. But again, the idea really to anchor this space, and we know that in Dubai South here, Expo City is really going to anchor the rest of Dubai. So these are some interesting patterns very early on in the design stages. It wasn't what you see today, but rather we were exploring, taking into account structure and the different patterning. So this is just to show some of the processes and the transition of how we eventually ended up where we are today. And the important thing is this ring here was an artifact found in an archaeological site called 𝗧cie𝗽𝗶𝗰. And this really helped inform the actual geometry, which you can see here, the Expo logo, and eventually an abstraction of that to the actual Wasl dome itself. And I think the important thing here is it's not copying, but really abstracting the principles of that and applying it in an architectural manner. And eventually, we end up with something like this, where you can see the abstraction of this pattern in plan view with the park below. So just to give a little bit more understanding of how we plan the spaces out, this orange space here, this is the space between the adjacent buildings and the outer part of the dome. This is a cafe zone, and if you've ever been to Expo site, you'll notice there's cafes there that are self-shaded. And then this purple zone, eventually during Expo City, this would turn into a roadway for cars, and the rest still maintains the park-like plaza space, and we also have the raising stage here for performances. And another thing here, you'll notice that the actual ground plane is depressed here, and there's an important reason for that, mainly because to pool the cool air at the bottom. And if you ever go to Expo City, you will notice that there is a significant microclimate difference. So this allows the air to come in and cool air to pool where all the people are congregated. So just some quick stats in terms of how high this is. It's 67.5 meters tall. That's 130-meter diameter, and we have an oculus at the top that is 35 meters. And this oculus is also important because this helps with the airflow and drawing the cool air through the bottom and exhausting the hot air through the top. Again, just some statistics, to look at some of the ancient domes, the Pantheon in Rome, the Cathedral in Florence, and what we eventually ended up here. Now, just to touch a little bit on kind of the components that make up the Wasl dome. It is 100% steel pipe filigree, and below grade you will see quite a significant superstructure that holds it up. And one of the most important parts, and this is the key to the success of the immersive experience in the video display, is this fabric, which I'll touch on a bit later. But this really creates the space and tempers the light and the intensity of the sun, especially during the summer months. Now, in terms of the immersive experience integrated into the design, there's 2,800 LEDs, there's 42 projector enclosures, and within those, there's 6 laser projectors, and this is what constitutes the video effect on the screen. And then, of course, part of the immersive experience is the audio component. So you will see blended into here, there's also 12 speaker enclosures. Now, in terms of how we achieved it, while it looks quite complex, if you break it down, it's actually composed of 27 kind of components. So you see here, this is kind of a typical component. And then in order to make this thing run, if you go and look at Wasl, you see it's quite clean, but there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. So within the pipes, there's a massive amount of infrastructure, and this ranges from water pipes to fiber optics to electrical. Everything that you see that actually makes this work is actually hidden inside of the pipes itself. So this was kind of a complex logistical situation that we had to address while we were doing the construction. Of course, here, nothing is complete without wind tunnel testing, which is an absolutely critical part of the design and to validate what we've done digitally. So you can run simulations all you want and see the results, but really taking it into a wind tunnel and validating the digital results, I think is key to really proving the success of allowing the airflow and the exhausting through the oculus. So that validated what we see here, which is kind of seeing where the wind flow is. And what we ended up finding out was the buildings that were built adjacent to it really do help funnel the air into the actual trellis. So if you ever get a chance to visit and you're standing at one of the kind of key pathways into here, you'll notice that there is an increased wind flow, which helps to mitigate the overall environment. And then, of course, what we really did was, what did it feel like without a dome? And what does it feel like with a dome? And these are just some examples of some mean radiant temperatures during the apex of the season here in the summer. So you could get up to a 70-degree mean radiant temperature where somebody is standing without the dome. But once you add it, it really brings it down to something much more manageable in the 30 degrees. And then lastly, before I delve off from the design, again, it's all about creating a procession, creating a visual presence of this. And right here, you can see the lightness of the actual fabric, which was key, but it still tempers the interior environment. And this is one of the main pathways coming from the metro. And then at night, you have something that you can enjoy at daytime, but also at nighttime when we have the immersive experience, which is key here. And this is something that really lights up. And one of the interesting aspects of the fabric is that the projections are both on the inside, but actually wrap around the individual strands of the fabric so you can see it from the outside. And I'll show a picture towards the end that really illustrates how you can start to see Wasl as a beacon, especially once they start expanding the airport when people are flying in. So this is the part where I'll get into a little bit of the background and you can see the details of how Wasl was constructed. So the interesting thing about this was the pipe for this is primarily used for oil pipes. And so we took something that I would say is kind of considered traditionally industrial and manipulated it here through all the various processes that I'll go over to come up with the filigree pattern that you see here. And then because it's all self-supporting, just showing where the compression and tension are. And if you break it down into its simple components, really it's an abstracted diagrid for the structure. So even though it looks like it's fairly complex, there is a lot of uniformity in terms of how the structural forces are acting upon this. So this was one of the early days for us when we were starting to test how these steel pieces come together. I think one of the important things about when you're designing something like this that's so atypical is how do these elements start to come together? And a lot of what we ended up with is resultant from these processes of testing how the various tubes started to come together. And we eventually ended up with a variation of this where we start to splice the tubes together. Now there's two types of steel that are used on this project, and what you'll see here is something called extruded steel pipes, and you will see kind of these stretch marks. So these was a type of steel that was used on the upper portion of the trellis, and then you see something here that's a little bit more smooth. This is actually formed by bending flat steel plate. And so when we have something that's closer to the eye, this is the kind of steel that we use. So getting into a little bit of the detail of how we start to form these components, you'll see here, these are these huge breaks that press the steel at each one of these marks here to bend a flat plate into a round tube. So this was the steel that was used at the arches that you see on Wasl. And again, bending these huge elements, because the steel pipes are around 1/2 meter in diameter, this is a process called cold bending, where they actually apply pressure at strategic points here to induce bending in the actual steel pipe. Now, once we get up into the more circular forms and the tighter radiuses, we have to use something called induction bending. And basically that involves using a magnetic field to heat up a specific area of the tube, and then we can pull it on a specified radius to achieve the kind of shape that we want. And then lastly, after all that bending, everything is sent back into the heater to anneal it, to rearrange the chemical composition and give the strength back, because after the stretching and the bending, you introduce weakness into the steel. Again, this is just some of the process of, okay, we've started to bend the steel, now we're starting to splice it together. And many of the circular elements are composed of several different radiuses combined together. Again, some more how they start to introduce these brackets here. And what you think might be complex while they're fabricating it, actually in the factory it's quite simple. They're using string lines and measuring tapes and fairly rudimentary methods, which is quite interesting when you think about the geometry of it. Some more images. These are before these elements are spliced together, but eventually the entire interior of this will be filled with infrastructure. Again, this is showing some of the splice plates. So when some of the steel elements are put together, these elements have to be put in to provide additional structural rigidity. And then these are brackets that are going to later be used for assembly on site. And of course, one of the most important aspects of this, because it had to be built within millimeter tolerance, is in the factory, they have to actually do the mock-ups, survey it, jot down all those numbers, and then once it's transported to site, they utilize those survey numbers to reassemble it. And of course, I always like this picture because of the scale in terms of the guys building the steel versus the actual elements themselves. And lastly, some of the finishing that we did on this, because we're in Dubai, we're close proximity to the sea, it's a highly corrosive environment. So we actually had to introduce a fairly robust painting system to this to ensure the longevity, because at the end of the day, this lives on in legacy mode for Expo City and anchors the development for years to come. Now this was something that we did very, very early on, even before we had completed the design. So this was a mock-up that we did on site, and this was actually very critical to the success in figuring out a lot of the anomalies that we encountered during the design process and the construction. And a lot of that is how it's built, what are the finishes, testing the fabric out. We did a lot of video projection testing on this to validate, our hypothesis, because before in Chicago, we were testing on little made-up pieces of fabric, and then coming out here and actually validating that on the mock-up proved to be critical and made for some adjustments in the overall construction. So that in the end, you end up with something like this, and you can see here where the seams are quite smooth. In the end, on the places where you're very close to it visually, you get almost like an automotive finish, which is quite incredible for something of this scale in terms of structural steel. So moving on to the steel erection of this project, once we finished the design and the documentation, construction started on the steel roughly in the early months, mid-months of 2018. And then from there, over the course of a year and a half, the construction process proceeded until we topped out and then started our testing with the projection. So what this is just showing here is the construction process involved kind of two phases. There's the bottom 45 meters of the trellis and then the top portion of the dome, which was constructed separately. So this part was constructed first, and then within this, once this was erected, this was constructed inside and then eventually strand jacked up. So it's just using wires to pull up this dome. So this is a picture I quite like because obviously it's fully developed now, but where you see the UAE flag here, this was the very center of what would soon be Wasl. So for me, it's quite an incredible transformation. So the enabling work started in 2017. Here you can see the basement, and this is part of the blinding that's taking place for the substructure. Here you can start to see the columns of what essentially is a concrete Vierendeel truss underground to support the forces for the trellis. And then as we begin to close out 2017, and we're around summer of 2018 where we start to erect some of the steel components. And so we worked our way around radially and eventually aggregated bigger and bigger in pieces. So this is just an example of the pieces of steel that actually came to us. A lot of this was done split between Italy, in a small town in northern Italy, and then also Abu Dhabi. So here you can start to see the temporary structure that is used to support this until it's stable in a concentric ring. And I'll just quickly go through some of these. But again, one of the complexities of this was the fact that we had several buildings being built within up to 6 meters adjacency of this. So it became a real logistics coordination solution. Again, this is showing almost at the top of the first phase of construction. And here we start to see pieces that are coming and being aggregated together on the ground before being lifted into place. And then in terms of the scale here, you can see the tower crane. So quite massive elements, and the scale of construction was impressive. And this is what would be the view from the metro today. And you can see some of the hierarchy of the arches here that we developed. Again, almost rounding out the first phase. And then this is where the construction of the upper 25 meters of the dome took place within the concentric circle. So again, a huge logistics issue in terms of how we started to put this together. But over the course of months, you can see the crawler cranes working their way out until we finally close the entire hemisphere portion of the dome. And then lastly, what you're seeing here is over the course of about a day and a half was the strand jacking process, where we lifted this entire dome up over 45 meters into the air. And then ultimately, there's a small little gap here where we had to do the infill pieces. And I think the most impressive thing and testament to the contractors was over a span of 130 meters at the base of this project, we were within 2 to 3 millimeters tolerance. So the big worry on our mind was, would the top of the hemisphere line up with the bottom part? And miraculously it did, which I think, I can't commend the contractors more than enough on the work that they did for that. And then I always think this is quite interesting as well, the scale of the cables in terms of what they were lifting. And then this is once it was fully lined up, and these cables here, when they're doing the strand jacking, actually the top of the dome actually wants to flatten out. So what these did, they act kind of like spokes on a bicycle wheel, and so they're able to push and pull the dome to align it with the bottom pieces. So the next part I wanted to talk about was the fabric, which in reality, this is a fiberglass mesh with a Teflon coating, so similar to what you see on a nonstick pan. So this is some sketches, and if you remember from the mock-up, we had straight seams, but this just didn't really suit the language. So what we explored was actually playing with the fabric and the seaming, and I think one of the things that we learned as we went through the process was how flexible this actual process of working with the fabric and the fabricators you could get. So really any kind of shape. So we played with, compressing and expanding the seams that seemed to flow from the very top to the bottom. And also, playing with light and shadow was a big part of the process as well. So you have the solid part of the steel, which gives you a very dark, hard shadow. Then you have the frame around the fabric, and then you have the seams. So you get this layering and filigree and different densities and shading of shadow. And of course, as the sun goes over the skyline and the seasons change, you see that translation across the plaza itself. So getting into a little bit more detail in terms of what are the actual components that allow this fabric to sit so perfectly in between the steel superstructure is here you have your steel pipe, you have brackets here that allow you to tension this fabric against the steel pipe. So every couple of years, they will come back in and there's bolts here that allow you to tension the fabric because over time it does start to lose its tension. So this is something that allows it to be used for an extended period of years. And another thing I wanted to touch on here was because there's so many of these fabrics, so many of these brackets in excess of 16,000 brackets. In the early days when we were working with our fabric contractor, this was the proposal for the bracket. Now, while it may seem small and the bracket is roughly this size, this weighed several kilos. And it was just built out of steel plate. And I thought, well, hey, we can explore something called topological optimization, which really, there's a lot of forces being acted upon these to keep these taut and stretched. So what this is showing is actually we ran the analysis of where the structural forces were going. And in the original bracket here, you can see that actually probably almost 50% of that material isn't actually needed. So what we ended up doing was taking this and abstracting it into this, which allowed us to cut the weight of these brackets in half, which in the grand scheme of things, if you multiply that by 16, 17,000, ends up being a significant cost savings. Plus, they also look cooler. And this is the process of the actual fabrication and how they assemble the fabric itself. So here you can see the pattern being cut, and then the actual PTFE being wrapped around this EPDM cord here and heat welded together. So it's almost like ironing it. And then lastly, for the fabric, the actual piece itself, you have these aluminum extrusion rails. And then, of course, in terms of scale, these are the guys, the abseilers that actually assembled these pieces. So it usually consists of a team of 2 or 3 guys. Not something that I would want to do personally, but these guys did an amazing job. And the gap between the aluminum and the steel is 150 millimeters, and they were able to maintain that on every single panel. So, the level of detail and attention to craft with these guys was incredible. And this is what you end up with here. So you can see the brackets, along with the rails and the seams, and I think something that really came together quite nicely. And then this is the filigree pattern that I was talking about earlier in terms of really utilizing a non-material to enhance the space. And I think this is something that still, amazes me to this day in terms of how this actually affects and changes the space. So the last thing I wanted to talk about was the immersive experience. Now the key to this is what resides in these guys here, these projector enclosures. So within these, there's 6 laser projectors that we actually, in the early days, we were using for our testing back in Chicago, we were using halogen-based projectors, but we approached a manufacturer who was in the early R&D phases for a laser projector. So we actually ended up collaborating with them to develop something quite bespoke for our Wasl. Now, later on, these are mainly used for cinemas, but here they developed a lot of new technology that was a result of the asks from us to be able to perform the immersive experience on the dome here. And I'll just go to some sketches here, and if we go back, these might look somewhat similar to what you would see on an airplane. So the engine, the cells of an airplane, and that's no coincidence. And this was something, it didn't always look like this, but one day when I was sitting on the plane and we're figuring out where we're going to put these projectors, because before they were living on the ground, and I was looking out the window, and I thought, well, hey, this round shape, it has the airplane engine, it performs, it's structural, it looks interesting, and the circle relates to the patterning that we developed here. So in the end, this is really what the inspiration is pulled from, is from engine nacelles. And these elements, these are the early sketches of this, was something to be quite lightweight. So these are all made out of aluminum. It's a monocoque aluminum shell with a stressed skin. And then within that, we house the projectors and the cooling system. Now there's 42 of these, and each one, while the shell is the same, the actual orientation of these is actually different because they need to project at different locations on the dome. So that presented some kind of complexity where we had to work with somebody to figure out how we can develop an attachment system for this to ensure that we could just unify the shells, and we just changed the arms that actually hold it. So here, this is what it looks like once you peel back the aluminum skin. You have an aluminum waffle structure here. And how we form this double curvature of the skin is we use a process called hydroforming, where we take a flat piece of aluminum and then we inject it with high pressure water to get us this shape here, which is eventually cut out and then stitch welded here. And the guys who built this, based out of Monterrey in Mexico, a group called 𝗗𝗍𝗄𝗃, after a long search worldwide, these were the only guys who really understood the intent that we wanted. And I think a large part of that is because they themselves are architects as well. So this is in their factory here and all the various components. And you can see here a big assembly line. And again, in terms of scale, you can see how big these things are. So it's a bit deceiving when you see it in person because they're perched about 18 meters high above the ground. But in terms of the scale, quite large. And then lastly, this is a picture before they're being installed on site, and you can see all the conduit that we've hidden, and this is all the infrastructure that's required to run the elements inside. And then one of my favorite parts here is because the painting system for the actual trellis itself is a somewhat satin finish, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that we live in a dusty environment and the sand build up. If it was something shiny, you would start to see the sand build up on it quite easily. So the semi-matte finish of the trellis allows you to hide that sand buildup. But with these enclosures, we envision them as pieces of jewelry that are hung off the Wasl dome here. So what you see is a large amount of gold metallic flake that's been embedded into these shells. And then this is it, in its completed state. So I just wanted to touch a little bit. I alluded to how these projectors, they're all oriented in a specific way to create one holistic, seamless 360-degree image. And I think the key to this, and the process for figuring out how to stitch all these together was done by much smarter people than myself, these experts. But this is, in reality, what the projectors are doing in terms of 3 levels of layering. So what you see here, you can't see the seams, but, and this is during our early commissioning days, where you can see each part of the trellis is actually mapped out from the steel to the fabric. And what you see here, these are the areas of overlap, but this is eliminated during the final production to end up with something like this. So this was actually one of the first performances at Wasl from an immersive experience, and this was an album release party for Alicia Keys. I think this was back in 2022. But again, this was when it really started to validate the original idea of this immersive experience and a place for people to gather, a place for performances. You can see that the place was totally packed out. You could feel the music in your body, completely enthralled with the 360-degree experience. And then lastly, the audio part, and you will see on the dome, we took the same kind of design philosophy for the projectors and utilized that for the speakers. So within here, we have these massive speakers that are critical to the actual overall experience. So again, starting off with a sketch and then working our way through resolution. And we utilize a lot of the same processes here. You can see the formwork being milled out. We used hydroforming. And again, these ribs ended up being filled with GRC, some of the covers. And the interesting thing about this is that the bottom and the front utilize a fabric. So this is an acoustically transparent part of the speakers while the back is solid. And this is to enable the sound to be directed towards everybody that's in the plaza. Again, part of the components. So I'll wrap up with a couple more images, but again, this was an image from when Coldplay was playing here. So again, I think the success of the project really lies in the fact of we can bring people together for these experiences. So it can be as intense as you want it to be, but it can also be as peaceful as you want it to be during the day, with the nighttime taking on, its own vibe. And I think this is something that I still enjoy. I come to Wasl quite frequently, is, in the end, what we created was not only an experience and a destination and an anchor, but really it's a canvas for the artists. And what I find intriguing is the ways that the actual artists and the videographers and the people who program this actually manipulate the space and the software that was developed for this to do new things. And I think as the years pass by, I see increasing complexity and things that we never even imagined that people would be able to do with it. And I remember about a year ago, there was even one lady who came and was doing kind of 3D calligraphy. So she was painting with goggles on the stage, and that painting was actually appearing on the dome. And again, in terms of performances, this was a shot from one of the ceremonies during Expo, but to illustrate the kind of full degree of immersiveness. And this is another shot with the LEDs, which also enhance, and these can be used to act like stars and add to the overall video experience. So I'll close with this one, and this sort of relates back to the idea that I touched on, that the experience is within, but it's also, you can see the projection on the outside as well. So if you imagine you're flying in on a plane, you can see this beating, from the air, which I think is quite incredible. So appreciate it, and I'll close with that.
Thank you so much, Architect 𝗵𝗿𝗂𝗧𝗍𝗪. That was very impressive, very outstanding presentation. Guys, any question? It's your chance to ask. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the dome was always envisioned to be a free-flowing public space. So it's for the people. And now Wasl meaning connection. This is the fundamental principle of that space. I know sometimes they change it a little bit when they have special events, but the idea was that the entire base is permeable. So all those arches, it was always meant to be open.
Nice. It looks structured. It looks stable. I don't know if you presented the wind, how the wind you know how you say it?
How the wind flows through the space?
Yeah, wind flowed on this and how the
Yeah,
wind,
I mean, I briefly alluded to, I mean, to be honest, I could probably spend a lot more time talking about it, but it is an important question. And so, do I have the pointer maybe? I can point to. So for example, in these pathways, these are 7 axes that actually lead to our Wasl Dome. And what we found was that actually the wind is channeled by the canyon of the buildings into this space. And at the oculus, the hot air tends to pool and exhaust out the top. So you're actually pulling in the cool air. So actually everything is contributing to a kind of positive airflow environment within the space here. So that was part, you know, in the early stages was testing digitally, but also using the wind tunnel to validate those. And of course, you can only take it so far with the models and the digital. And really the true validation is when it's built, is it actually performing like that? And I would say that yes, it is. And I can't tell you how many times I've been standing there and been surprised that actually, if I'm standing somewhere else, maybe out here, it's somewhat static air. But if I'm standing in here in front of one of the openings, I am catching a breeze that really does help cool you off.
Well, since we don't have time, so may we request our chapter secretary, Architect Lilian Reyes, and our chapter president, Architect 𝗗𝗂𝗶𝗰, to join us here to present this plaque of appreciation to Architect 𝗃𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗃.
Yes.
Brings a special light.
This plaque of appreciation is presented to Tim Winstonley, Atkins Realist, in grateful recognition for being the resource speaker in the UAP 124 Dubai's Year-End Conference 2024, given this Sunday, 8th of December 2024 at 𝗃𝗂𝗃𝗀𝗃 Pavilion, Expo City, Dubai, UAE. Thank you so much.
Recognize the art that shapes our nation's rise. In December